Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 29, The Marathas. The 8th Emperor Aurangzeb died on February 1707, worn out by his long guerrilla campaign in the Deccan. His successor, Bahadur Shah, decided in 1708, on the advice of Zulfikar Khan, the Viceroy of the Deccan, to try out a plan Aurangzeb had occasionally dallied with of restoring the kingdom of Shivaji and to put on his throne Shahu, Shivaji's grandson, who after the capture and execution of his father Shambhaji in 1689 had been raised in the Mughal court. He had so much absorbed its uses that he continued to use the pet name Shahu, signifying something like our little scoundrel, that Aurangzeb had given to him, rather than his real name, Shivaji II. Shahu was then not yet 26 years old. Daud Khan, the deputy viceroy who was stationed at Aurangabad, was directed to give him all the possible assistance. As we saw in episode 21, after Shambhaji's death, the direction of Maratha affairs had fallen into the hands of his half-brother Raja Ram. Raja Ram died in 1700, and then his widow Tarabai, a strong, masterful woman, declared herself regent for her infant son Shivaji, and profiting from the disorders at Delhi, she had reconquered Pune and the Konkan from the Mughals. Precisely as was Zulfikar Khan's intention, the return of Shahu sowed discord in the Maratha camp. Tarabai refused to give up her son's claims. She claimed Shahu to be an impostor, assembled her ministers, and made them swear to resist the pretender to the throne to the last gasp. Shahu had been granted the customary dues of Chaud and Sardesh Mukhi of the 6 Deccan provinces of Khandesh, Berar, Aurangabad, Bidar, Hyderabad and Bijapur, and the governorship of Gondwana, Gujarat and Thanjavur, which he was to hold for the emperor. Starting from north of the Narmada in May 1707, Shahu advanced slowly southward during the rains, entered Satara and was crowned there in January 1708. He made Gadadhar Prahat his Pratinidhi, Bahiro Pan Pinkle his Peshwa, and Dhanasri Jadhav his Senapati or commander-in-chief. Tarabai fell back upon Panhala, the great stronghold 12 miles south of Kolhapur, which became the capital of the rival kingdom. As soon as the rains were over, Shahu, after celebrating the Dasra, the festival which marks the opening of the campaigning season, marched against Tarabai and took Panhala. In 1712, Tarabai was removed from the administration by a palace intrigue, and her place was taken by her co-wife, Rajasbai, who claimed the throne for her son, Shambhaji, in turn. But this did not help Shahu much, whose hold on his new kingdom became every day more precarious. Very few of the great Maratha leaders had sided with him, and his rule was practically confined to Satara, and to a few hill forts where he had stationed trusty commanders. The Deccan was in confusion. The Deshmukhs and the petty chiefs had fortified themselves in their villages in which they resided, and their plundered caravans held up travellers to ransom and fought one another. The new viceroy of the Deccan, Chin Kulich Khan, who succeeded Daud Khan at Aurangabad in 1712 with the title of Nizam-ul-Mulk, was inclined to favour the Kolhapur party. And Chandra Sen Jadhav, the Senapati, who had assumed that office on the death of his father Danachi in 1708, had gone over to Kolhapur, taking part of the army with him, owing to the disagreement with Shahu. But his desertion led to the rise of a remarkable man, a man who was destined to become the savior of the Marathas. Balaji Viswanath was a Shitpavan or Konkanasta Brahmin, whose ancestors were hereditary Deshmukhs of Srivardhan near Bankot. His early history is obscure, but towards the end of the 17th century his father appears to have migrated to the Deccan and taken service at the Satara court. For a time he served under Danachi Yadav, the Senapati, who held him in high esteem and gave him several responsible posts. This aroused the jealousy of Danachi's son Chandra Sen, and shortly after the latter became Senapati, a quarrel broke out which caused Balaji to flee for his life to Shahu's protection. Chandra Sen insolently demanded his surrender from Shahu, and being refused, proceeded to join the Kolhapur faction. Balaji Viswanath, in gratitude to Shahu, made himself invaluable to the king, in whose favour he rose daily higher and higher. He enlisted fresh forces, for which he received the title of Senakarta, the maker of armies, and came to terms with the Nizam. He next attacked a notorious robber chief, Damachi Torat of Hingangaon, who however defeated him and held him up to ransom. He had better luck in putting down another rebel, Krishna Rao of Katau. Meanwhile, Shahu had dispatched an army under Baji Rao Pinkle, the peshwa, to protect the Konkan and overthrow Kanaji Angria, the hereditary admiral of the Maratha fleet, who had taken the opportunity afforded by the disorders to ally himself with Kolhapur, advanced up the Borghat and seized the forts of Rajmachi and Lohagar, commanding this important highway into the Deccan. But the Peshwa was a mediocre general, and he suffered himself to be defeated and captured. Angria now threatened to march on Satara. Shahu was in despair, and looked about him to discover a fit person to recover his conquered district, says the Chronicle of Shitness. He applied to the Pratinidi, but that officer excused himself on the ground that the army was not as his devotion. Then, in the words of the Maratha chronicler, quote, he sent for the 8 Pradhans, communicated to them the accounts he had received, and desired them to take the necessary measures for checking these depredations. They all remained silent. He then looked towards Balaji, who caught up and addressed the Raja, saying, "If you will give me orders, through your good fortune they will be carried into effect." Upon this, the Raja placed his hand on Balaji's head and desired him to take the troops. The Maharaja gave him the entire administration of affairs with the robes of the peshwaship. His fame and greatness were daily augmented. The 8 pradhans of the state, that is the ministers of the state, became subject to him. End quote. The new Peshwa set about his task with grim determination. Being himself a Konkani and an old friend of Angria, his main task was a comparatively easy one. He arranged a meeting with the Maratha admiral at a spot not far from the modern town of Lonaula, and the two soon came to terms with one another. He persuaded Angria to release the unfortunate ex-Peshwa, Baji Rao Pant Pingle, and to transfer his allegiance from Kolhapur to Shahu. In return, he undertook to get him confirmed in the title of Sarkil, Admiral, and to allow him to retain possession of Rajmachi and other strongholds he possessed. At the same time, he joined him in attacking Angria's hereditary enemy, the Sidi, who was deprived of many of his conquests in the Konkan. This was Balaji's first great diplomatic triumph. Kanhoji Angria, however, until his death in 1729, remained an ally rather than a vassal of the Peshwas. The Angrias behaved like independent rulers, making war at will upon their neighbors, the Sidis, the Portuguese and the English, and levying what they chose to call the chout of the sea upon coastal traffic. Several expeditions sent against Angria from Bombay were repulsed with heavy losses, until, in 1755, Robert Clive and Admiral Watson, cooperating with the Peshwa's land forces, overthrew their stronghold at Geria of Vijayadurg and put an end to their power. Balaji, on his return from the Konkan, determined to put a stop to the anarchy in Shahu's kingdom. Freebooters were suppressed with a strong hand, and an example was made of Damaji Torat, whose stronghold was razed to the ground, while he himself was thrown into a dungeon. Civil government was restored, and the Pratihindi and the Ashtaparadhana, or the Cabinet of 8, were reappointed. But the old system of government that had been established by Shivaji was no longer workable. At home, the real power now lay in the hand of the Peshwa, while in the more distant parts of the country, the great Maratha chiefs were virtually independent. Balaji realized that the only possible working arrangement was a confederacy of Maratha leaders. But even so, the separatist tendencies were constantly at work, and the jealousy felt by the Maratha chiefs for the power wielded at the court by the Brahman Peshwa was a constant source of conflict and of danger. But Balaji was by no means content with merely keeping the peace. His ambitions and far-seeing mind had already conceived the plan of freeing his country entirely from foreign domination. His master was still a vassal of Delhi, and the Peshwa's dream was to make Shahu ruler over Shivaji's Swaraj, that is, all the districts ruled over by Shivaji at the time of his death. The times were propitious. The once mighty Mughal Empire was breaking apart. The throne of Delhi, as we saw in the previous 2 episodes, was occupied by a series of puppet rulers, and all the real power was now in the hands of the so-called kingmakers, the Said brothers. One of them, Husain Ali Khan, became Viceroy of the Deccan in 1715. He found, however, that he could make no headway against the court intrigues which went on during his absence, and the depredations of the local Maratha chiefs. In 1716 he was defeated by Kanda Rao Dabade, the veteran Maratha leader who was levying chout on the Gujarat border. In desperation he opened negotiations with Shah. This was a golden opportunity to Balaji Viswanath. He proposed terms to the Sayyid that the emperor could confirm Shah in the right of collecting the chout and Sardeshmukhi from the 6 provinces of the Deccan, from Mysore, Tiruchinopoli and Thanjavur, and that Shah was to exercise sovereign rights in all the territory composing Shivaji's Swaraj, except certain portions of Khandesh. In return for this, territories in the Pandharpur district should be ceded. Shah, on his side, was to pay 1,000,000 rupees as tribute in return for the Swaraj, and 10% of the annual income for the hereditary rights of Sardeshmukhi. He was also to maintain a body of 15,000 horse in the emperor's service and protect the country from depredations and robbery. The wretched Emperor Farrukhsiyar protested in vain against this surrender of his rights and territories. Hussain Ali Khan, accompanied by Balaji and 15,000 Maratha horsemen on the Kandahar Daubade, marched on Delhi and, as we saw in the previous episode, after some fierce street fighting, Sayyid Abdullah seized the emperor, blinded him, threw him into a dungeon and finally murdered him. Balaji stayed in Delhi until the new emperor, Muhammad Shah, was forced to get rid of his unwelcome visitor by issuing 3 imperial rescripts allowing the Marathas to gather the chout, Sardeshmukhi and Swaraja, respectively. Balaji returned in triumph to Satara, where honours were showered upon him. But he was now nearing 60, and the hardships of the campaign had been too great for him. He retired to his country house at Saswat near Purandar, where he expired on April 1720. His life work had been completed, however. Balaji Viswanath may, without exaggeration, be termed the second founder of the Maratha Empire. Without him, Shahu Raja, alienated by his upbringing at the Mughal court from his Maratha surroundings, would not have survived for even 1 year. His 2 great diplomatic triumphs were the conciliation of Angria and the treaty with Delhi. But scarcely less characteristic was his method of revenue collection, to which the Marathas owed to a great extent their power. He deliberately preferred assignments on other proprietors, like Chout or Sardeshmukhi, to solid territorial possessions or even a consolidated sum. Hence the network of revenue collectors was spread everywhere in the imperial domain, affording the Marathas endless opportunities for spreading their influence. Pretexts or justifications for interference and encroachments in an extensive territory were better than clearly defined rights in a small one. Furthermore, by insisting that the revenue should be calculated on the assessment of the time of Todar Mal or Malik Ambar, which he knew well a country ravaged by war could never pay, he could always have a bill for arrears in hand. Finally, by parceling out the revenue among the chiefs, he ensured that, while each had an interest in increasing the contribution to the common stock, none had a compact property such as might render him independent of the government. And lastly, the system was purposely made so complicated as to throw all the power into the hands of Brahman revenue collectors and agents, who, being of the same caste as the Peshwa himself, naturally played into his hands. Balaji Viswanath, says Richard Temple about him, had a calm, comprehensive and commanding intellect, an imaginative and aspiring disposition, and an aptitude for ruling rude natures by moral force, a genius for diplomatic combinations, and the mastery of finance." End quote. When Balaji Viswanath died, he left two sons, Baji Rao, a man of 22, and Chimnachi Apte, a boy of 12. Both were destined to play a distinguished part in their country's destiny. At the time of his father's death, Baji Rao was on field service, but on his return, 2 weeks later, he was invested by Shah with the Peshwa's robes of office. The Peshwaship was already becoming hereditary. Baji Rao, though so young, was admirably suited for the post. Balaji, according to some of his critics, was a statesman rather than a soldier. He was even said not to have been a skilled horseman, and the story was told that at one time he had required a man on each side to hold him on his horse. None, even in jest, could say this of Baji Rao, who had been brought up in the saddle and had led cavalry charges at an age when other lads are still learning to ride in the sand. A contemporary artist represented him in the dress of a common trooper, sitting with his reins on his horse's neck, while he rubbed between his hands ears of corn. On this dry grain he would subsist for days, and at night he would sleep on the ground like an ordinary soldier. His bridle over his arm and his lance struck in the ground beside him. Such a man the Marathas would follow, as they followed Shivaji in the olden days, to the gates of hell, if need be. From the moment he took office, he set out to carry into effect his father's lofty designs for the extension of the Hindu Padpachai. Balaji's expedition to Delhi had revealed to him the weakness of the Mughals, and Baji Rao conceived the bold plan of attacking and overrunning the rich and fertile plains of Malwa and extending Maratha rule into the heart of Hindustan. With the foresight rare in someone so young, he saw that such a plan would, by giving occupation to the turbulent Maratha chiefs, not only extend the boundaries of Shahu's kingdom, but lead to peace nearer home. This ambitious policy was opposed by Shripad Rao, the Pratinidhi. The Pratinidhi, or viceroy, was really the first and the Peshwa the second official in the court, and Shripad Rao and the other Deccanis viewed with jealousy the meteoric rise of the young Shitpavan from the Konkan. At the council, the Pratinidhi stigmatized an invasion of Hindustan. Before Shahu's domestic dissensions were composed as rash and imprudent, and he advised as an alternative the reduction of Kolhapur and the reconquest of the Karnataka. But Baji Rao's eloquence swept all opposition. "Now is our time," he said the Peshwa, "to drive the strangers from the country of the Hindus and acquire immortal renown. Let us strike at the trunk of the withering tree, and the branches will fall of themselves. By directing our efforts to Hindustan, the Maratha flag shall fly from the Krishna to the Altok." "You shall plant it beyond the Himalayas," exclaimed Shahu, carried away by the Peshwa's eloquence. "You are indeed a noble son of a worthy father." From this day onward, the faces of the Marathas were turned northwards. It is significant that the chief gateway of every Maratha fortress is the Delhi gate. In 1724, Baji Rao crossed the Narmada in force. Little resistance was met with, for some of the Rajputs were now beginning to side with the Marathas, and Raja Jai Singh of Ajmer actively assisted them. Malwa was repeatedly overrun, and 3 Maratha chiefs, Udachi Pawar, Malhar Rao Holkar, and Ranaji Scindia, were left behind to collect the tribute. They were the founders of the princely houses of Dar, Indore and Gwalior. The 2 latter were soldiers of fortune who had won their spurs on the battlefield. Malhar Rao Holkar was of Dankar or shepherd caste, and he had started life as a trooper. Ranaji Scindia had originally been in service of Shahu. Another family which arose into prominence at that time was that of the Kaikwar of Baroda. Damaji Kaikwar won distinction at the Battle of Balapur in 1720 when fighting against Nizam under Kande Rao Dabade, for which Shahu conferred on him the title of Shamshir Bahadur or illustrious swordsman, a title still borne by the descendants of his family. About this time also arose the practice of assigning the attack on a particular province to a certain commander. To Kande Rao Dabade, who had been made Senapati for defeating the forces of Husain Ali Khan in 1716, was in this way assigned the collection of the dues in Baglan and Gujarat. In 1720, Pilaji Kaikwar, the nephew of Damaji, built himself a fortress at Songar, 50 miles east of Surat, and proceeded to levy Choud and Sardeshmukhi as Kande Rao's lieutenant. Sarbuland Khan, the Mughal viceroy, was powerless to interfere, and presently Pilaji was joined by Kanteji Kandem Barde, an officer of Shahu. From this time onward, the fair province of Gujarat enjoyed no respite from the Maratha stranglehold. When the Marathas proceeded beyond their boundary, to collect revenue and make war was synonymous. Whenever a village resisted, its officers were seized and compelled by threats and sometimes by torture, more or less severe, to come to a settlement. Money was seldom obtainable, but securities from bankers, with whom all the villagers were dealing, were preferable as they were exchangeable for bills payable in any part of India. The harvest season was for obvious reason usually selected for these mulk-kiri operations. Villages which resisted were plundered and some houses were burned and the crops destroyed. Only when the monsoon made the movements of troops impossible did the wretched inhabitants obtain a temporary respite. Then calm succeeded. The fall of the rain brought back the cheering green. The beautiful province of Gujarat was once again clothed in all its natural beauties by verdure and luxuriant vegetation. Tranquility seemed to reign, where a short time before nothing was to be seen but perpetual skirmishing, murder and rape. The scene now shifts back to Delhi. Chinkulich Khan, Nizam ul Mulk, had determined to set up for himself in the Deccan. In 1720 he suddenly crossed the Narmada and marched southward. Asirkar and Berhampur capitulated, and Chandra Sen Yadav and a number of disaffected Marathas flocked to his standards. He routed Dilawar and Achim Ali Khan, the governor of the Deccan, who had been sent against him by the Sayyids at the battles of Khandwa and Balapur in June and August 1720. In the latter battle, a detachment of Marathas under Kandera Dabade and Damaji Kaikwar fought on the imperial side with great gallantry. Further opposition was ended when Sayyid Hussain Ali was murdered and his brother defeated and thrown into prison, thus putting an end to the power of the kingmakers. Nizam now made his way into the Deccan unopposed. No sooner did he arrive than he began to renew his intrigues with Chandra Sen Yadav and other rebels and with Kolhapur. but he was everywhere foiled by the young peshwa, who had stationed a considerable army of observation to watch him. In 1722, however, he was recalled by the emperor, and on 21 February at Agra he was formally invested with the office of minister. He at once set himself to restore the empire to some sort of order and to abolish revenue farming, the grants of assignments and the innumerable other abuses which had arisen. But his efforts only excited the derision of the young emperor and of his degenerate court, who were determined to thwart everything he attempted to do, and even ridiculed in his face the stern soldier, whose rough manners were better adapted to the camp than to the palace. In December 1723, the Nizam could tolerate this state of things no longer. He determined to shake the dust of Delhi from off his feet, and on the pretext of going on a hunting expedition, he decided to retire to the Deccan. Muhammad Shah, however, knew that this practically amounted to a declaration of independence, and treacherously sent word to Mubarak Khan, the governor of Hyderabad, to intercept and kill him, if possible. Shahu, who disliked Mubarak Khan, decided to help Nizam, and Baji Rao found himself for the first and last time fighting side by side with his rival. The decisive engagement took place at Shakarkelda in Berar, 11 October 1724. Mubarak Khan was routed and killed, and Nizam marched on to Hyderabad and took it. He determined to make the city his capital, for which it offered many advantages. Being further from Satara than Aurangabad, it enabled him to conceal his movements more effectually from the Marathas, and it was better placed for operations against the Karnataka, upon which Nizam had already designs. From this time dates the virtual independence of the Nizam, and a new factor was added to Deccan politics. Having failed to put him out of the way, the emperor pardoned and confirmed him in the government of the Deccan, depriving him, however, of the post of minister and the provinces of Gujarat and Malwa. The peace between Nizam and the Marathas could not endure very long. Nizam chafed at the presence of the Maratha tax-gatherers in Hyderabad, and in 1726, while Balaji Rao was away in the Karnataka, he pursued assiduously his favourite policy of fishing in troubled waters. Always an easy matter, as the Maratha chiefs cordially disliked Shipavan domination at Shahu's court. Once again he came to terms with Prince Sambhaji of Kolhapur, who viewed with apprehension the Peshwa's growing interest in Carnatic affairs. In 1726, while Baji Rao was absent on a campaign, the two allies made a surprise attack on Shahu, who was for a time in considerable danger. The return of Baji Rao, however, soon restored the situation, and after the Dashera festival, on 13 September 1727, the Peshwa advanced northwards, driving his enemies before him across the Godavari and devastating the country all round him. By a series of masterly maneuvers, he then proceeded to draw Nizam into the waterless region between Aurangabad and Paitan. Here he surrounded and attacked him near the town of Palkate, 11 March 1728. Nizam's artillery alone saved him from annihilation. Retreat through the devastated area was impossible, and on 22 March he was compelled to sue for peace. Thus Baji Rao, unaided, had brought to his knees the foremost soldier of his time. It was a feat of arms of which any commander might well have been proud. The treaty was signed at Shifkaun. Nizam agreed to reinstate the Maratha tax gatherers, to pay up all arrears of Chaud and Sardesh Mukhi, and to recognize Shahu as sole monarch of the Deccan. But like an honorable soldier, he refused to consent to a clause requiring him to surrender his ally, Shambhaji. The importance of this treaty can scarcely be overestimated. It was a diplomatic triumph of the First Order and a worthy sequel to the brilliant maneuvers in the field which had preceded it. It left Shahu at least the undisputed ruler in his ancestors' Swaraj, and it was a deadly blow to Baji Rao's rivals in the Maratha court. Little wonder that after this Shahu depended still more upon his young minister, who had once again saved him from virtual annihilation. There still remained the smouldering embers of the war to be extinguished in Gujarat. Trimbak Rao Dabade, who had succeeded to the title of Senapati after the death of his father, the veteran Kande Rao, in January 1730 was assembling troops and plotting with Pilaji Kaikwar and other chiefs to protect the Raja's authority by ridding him of his peshwa, as they said. He had opened negotiations with Nizam. But Baji Rao, by means of his excellent system of espionage, was well aware of all that was taking place. Meanwhile, in the south, Prince Shambhaji, who had been allowed to retire to Panhala after the signing of the treaty, had allied himself to a freebooter named Udachi Chauhan and had encamped in bravado on the north side of the Varna, insolently demanding to be recognized as independent ruler of the southern half of the Swaraj. As Baji Rao was preoccupied with affairs in Gujarat, Shahu sent Shripad Rao Pratinidhi to deal with his cousin. The Pratinidhi took the field in January 1730 and surprised the Kolhapur army while it was encamped. The rout was complete and Shripad Rao captured the royal camp with all its inmates, including Tarabai, Rajabai, Shambhaji's wife Jijibai, and many Maratha chiefs of note. Shahu behaved with his usual magnanimity. He released all his prisoners. His aunt, Tarabai, however, asked not to be sent back. The lot of the senior Maharani, when the son of her co-wife reigns, is never an enviable one. Wherever I go, she said, I shall have a prison as my lot. Here or there, all is one to me. Let me stay in peace. Her request was, unfortunately for the state, acceded to, and the old queen retired to Satara to bide her time for fresh plots. Meanwhile, Shambhaji had surrendered unconditionally, and the two cousins met at a magnificent darbar where they were formally reconciled. A treaty, commonly known as the Treaty of Varna, the river being the boundary between the territories of the combatants, was signed on 13 April 1731. This left Shambhaji with only a shadow of his former power, and after this he ceased to be an important factor in Maratha history until his death in 1760. The long strife between the rival houses of Kolhapur and Satara, which had gone on since 1708, was for the time being settled. Meanwhile, important events were taking place more to the north. Throughout the rainy season of 1730, Baji Rao had been making preparations for the invasion of Gujarat with the assistance of his brother Chimnaji Apte. On 10 October, the brothers celebrated the Dasara in great splendor at Pune and took the field at once. In February 1731, Baji Rao reached Ahmedabad and concluded a treaty with the new viceroy, Abhay Singh of Marwar, who had been sent to supersede Sir Buland Khan. On 1 April, 12 days before Shah and Shambhaji signed the Treaty of Varna, the Peshwa moved out to meet the forces of Trimbak Rao and his lieutenant, the Kaikwar, on the broad plain of Bilhapur between Baroda and Daboy. The Senapati's numerous levies proved no match for the small but compact army of the Peshwa. The famous Gada Paka, the house-walled cavalry, carried all before it. But Trimbak Rao, disdaining offers to surrender, chained together the legs of his war elephant and continued the fight single-handed until a musket ball, fired, it is now known, by a traitor's hand, brought him down, while he was drawing the bowstring to his ear. The pious Shahu, deeply shocked by this fratricidal strife, behaved with the utmost chivalry towards the family of his late Senapati and bestowed the office upon his younger brother Yashwant Rao. But the family of Dabade never recovered its prestige, and Baji Rao, his last and greatest rival now removed, was now sovereign in all but name. In Gujarat, the power once wielded by the Dabades now passed to their erstwhile lieutenants, the Kaikwars, the Mughal viceroy receding more and more into the background. Pilochi Kaikwar was assassinated by Abhay Singh, the Mughal viceroy, in 1732 and was succeeded by Damaji II, who was present at Panipat and died in 1768. We must now turn our attention to Malwa, where Udachi Pawar, Malhar Rao Holkar and Ranoji Scindia had been steadily undermining Mughal power. On 8 December 1728 at Sarangpur, they defeated and killed the governor, Raja Kirdar Bahadur, who for 10 years had struggled to prevent the Marathas from getting a firm footing in this province. His successor, Daya Bahadur, suffered a similar fate at Tala near Dar. In 1732, the Peshwa himself took command over the Maratha forces, sending back his brother and Pilaji Yadav to watch over his interests at Satara. On his arrival there, he found the new viceroy was Muhammad Khan Bankash, whom he had defeated in Bundelkhand in 1729. Muhammad Khan, receiving no support from Delhi, was unable to stop the Maratha incursion and was relieved by Raja Jai Singh of Ajmer. In 1733, the Peshwa placed in charge of Bundelkhand a Brahmin officer named Govind Pant Kher, who afterwards was known as Bundala and played a part in the Panipat campaign. The great Rajput barons, who had once been the guardians of the empire on its western border, were now more and more openly throwing off their allegiance to the Mughal Empire and welcomed the Marathas as the champions of the Hindu religion. In 1736, Jai Singh came to terms with the Peshwa, appointing him as deputy governor of Malwa on condition that he did not plunder imperial territories. This amounted to the virtual cession of the province and had not the smallest deterrent effect on Maratha depredations. The following year saw their horsemen crossing the Jamuna and plundering the Doab. It was now that Baji Rao planned one of his boldest strokes. In March 1737, Saadat Khan, the governor of Awadh, had defeated Malhar Rao Holkar and, elated by this success, wrote a vainglorious letter to Delhi boasting that he had driven the Marathas across the Chambal. Hearing this, wrote Baji Rao to his brother, I was resolved to let the emperor know the truth, to prove that I was still in Hindustan, and to show him flames and the Marathas at the gate of the capital. Gathering a picked body of horsemen and covering 10 days' marches in two, he swooped down upon Delhi. Fugitives, distraught with terror, poured into the city. The government, at first incredulous and then panic-stricken, gathered together all available forces and dispatched them to chastise the invaders. Baji Rao, adopting the usual Maratha tactics, skillfully fell back until he had drawn his opponents away from the walls and well out into the open. Then he turned, and in a moment Malharao Holkar, with Ranoji Scindia hard at his heels, crashed into their ranks. That day the Maratha sword and lance drank deep of the blood of the proudest of the Mughal nobles. Over 600 were slain, and the troopers helped themselves freely to riderless horses with their gorgeous equipments of cloth and gold. The terrified emperor awaited in fear and trembling the approach of the victors, but before dawn Baji Rao had vanished as swiftly as he came, cleverly outmaneuvering an imperial army under the ministers, which tried to cut off his retreat. By this time the opinion began to prevail that only one person could now save the empire and stem the flood of the Maratha invasion. That was Nizam, who, as we have seen, had shaken the dust of Delhi from off his feet 14 years before. He was now at Berhampur, closely watched by Chimnatji Apte, who had received orders, if his opponent crossed the Narmada, to fall on his rear and put heel ropes on him, as the Maratha correspondence says. The Nizam's change of front was no doubt inspired by the apprehension he must have felt at the growing power of the Marathas in Hindustan. In April 1737, the Nizam set out for Delhi by way of Gwalior and Agra. The capital was reached in July, and his reception was one of the most amazing sights ever witnessed in that ancient city. The ministers escorted him personally to the emperor's presence amidst crowds which loudly welcomed him as their savior. After staying as the imperial guest until August, he took the field in order to drive the Maratha marauders out of Hindustan. But he found Baji Rao awaiting him, and once more he proved no match for his nimble antagonist. He suffered himself to be shepherded into Bhopal, where he was closely besieged, and as at Palkade, almost exactly 10 years earlier, he was once more compelled by the Peshwa to sign a humiliating treaty. He agreed to grant to Baji Rao the whole of Malwa, with the complete sovereignty of the territory between the Narmada and the Chambal, and to obtain the emperor's confirmation for these terms. Hence the calling in of the Nizam, instead of helping the emperor, merely led to the humiliation of Nizam and the emperor, and to the crowning triumph of Baji Rao. The Mughal Empire was tottering to its fall. It only needed the invasion of Nadir Shah, already on the horizon, to complete its destruction. The sudden eruption of Nadir Shah into Hindustan in 1739 caused panic at Pune, and for a moment Baji Rao thought that he might continue his march southwards into the Deccan. Our domestic quarrels, he now wrote, are insignificant. There is now but one enemy in Hindustan. Hindu and Muslim, the whole power of the Deccan, must assemble. I shall spread our Marathas from the Narmada to the Chambal. However, the menaced invasion of the Deccan failed to materialize, and the Peshwa was able to continue his operations uninterrupted. Malwa and Gujarat had been virtually added to the Maratha Empire, but the Konkan, the fertile strip of country between the Ghats and the sea, still remained unsubdued. Here there were three rival powers: the Angrias of Calabar, the Abyssinians of Janjira, and the Portuguese. The Angrias, in spite of Kanhoji's agreements with Shahu, defied the control of the Peshwas and levied on their own authority the chout of the sea on passing vessels. Equally powerful were their rivals, the Siddhis, the hereditary Mughal admirals. The Maratha campaigns in the Konkan were however a failure, and their chief result was to bring the Marathas into contact and into conflict with the Portuguese. The Portuguese had been old enemies of the Marathas, on religious as well as political grounds, but during the Peshwa's preoccupation in the north they had been left at peace. Their possessions on the Bombay coast were grouped together under the title of the Province of the North. Its governor, the General of the North, had his capital at Vasai. The island of Salsade, which was in Portuguese hands, is separated from the mainland by a long, narrow creek or arm of the sea, the end of which of course stands the island of Bombay. Vasai at the northern and Tana at the southern extremities of which guarded the two entrances. Along the coast were a number of fortified positions. Baji Rao cast covetous eyes on the fertile and almost defenceless island of Salsade with its green rice fields, grove and orchards. Here was a fruit ready to be plucked. The excuse, if one was needed, was afforded by the haughty Louis Botelliu, the governor of Vasai, who grossly insulted the Peshwa's envoy by speaking of his master as a nigger. Baji Rao concentrated a large force at Pune in the cold weather of 1737. And being himself fully occupied with defense in Hindustan, he entrusted it to his brother, Chimnachi Apte. The Maratha army moved down the passes with great speed and secrecy, and on 6 April 1737 captured Tana, which commanded the southern entrance of the Salsade Channel. Until the break of the monsoon, the Marathas occupied their time in overrunning Salsade and reducing the fortresses on the island. As soon as the rains were over, they made a general assault on Vasai itself. But the storming party, 9,000 strong, was completely defeated by its gallant defenders, who manned the walls sword in hand, threw down the scaling ladders, and killed or captured everyone who reached the rampart. Meanwhile, the government of Goa sent 2 shiploads of troops on the Pedro de Melu to the relief of Vasai. The Melu at once realized that Tana was the key to the position. Should he ever retake it, the Maratha forces in Salsade would be cut off. But in the meantime the Marathas also received large reinforcements. Baji Rao's campaign in Malwa had come to a successful conclusion, and Holkar and other Maratha leaders had hastened to the scene of operations. The Melu was killed in action, and his troops were driven back to their boats in disorder. Vasai was now doomed. The Portuguese appealed for help to the English at neighbouring Bombay, and it cannot be said that the latter behaved with credit in this matter. They had indeed little love for their rivals, and they were anxious to do nothing to offend the Marathas. They accordingly temporized. To the Portuguese they merely tendered good advice, while to the Marathas they supplied powder and shot. It was even asserted that the Portuguese commander was killed by a piece aimed by an English gunner. The letters of the Portuguese commander are full of dignity and pathos. The garrison, he says, is starving and worn out by constant fighting. There is no money to pay the soldiers. All the church plate has long ago been melted down. And he wrote, quote, "The Marathas have carried on mines, covered ways and other approaches to the very foundations of the wall. Their batteries being very near the town, they throw large stones into the place from mortars." A little moved by this touching appeal, the Bombay Council sent the Portuguese 200 barrels of gunpowder and 4,000 rounds of cannon shot. But nothing could save the city. On 13 May a mine was sprung under one of the principal bastions, and the Maratha storming parties, led in person by their greatest captains, Malharao Holkar, Ranachi Scindia, Manachi Angria, and Chimnachi Apte himself swarmed up the walls only to be driven back in disorder. 11 times the columns moved to the assault, and 11 times they were repulsed with slaughter. And when the attack was renewed at daylight, it was found that the Portuguese had repaired the breach. But the next day another mine was exploded, and the Marathas established themselves in a position among the ruins, from which they could enfilade the defences. All that day the Portuguese maintained an unequal combat with the courage of despair, and in the evening Chimnachi sent an envoy to say that unless the town surrendered, further mines would be exploded and the whole population put to the sword. The governor then capitulated, after one of the most heroic defences in history. The severity of the fighting is indicated by the fact that the Maratha losses were estimated at 20,000 out of a total of 22,000. Chimnachi chivalrously allowed the garrison to march out with the honours of war and a safe conduct to Koa or Daman, while those who preferred to remain were promised complete religious freedom. The English, be it said to their honour, did all in their power to help the refugees. The fall of Bassein warned the English at Bombay to prepare for a similar peril. A sum of 30,000 rupees was subscribed by the Indian merchants of the town for the purpose of putting the defences in order, and 2 embassies were dispatched, one under Captain Inchbird to visit King Shah in the Deccan, and the other under Captain Corden to congratulate Chimnachi Apte at Bassein. Both were entirely successful, and a treaty was drawn up, dated 12 July 1739, giving the English the right to free trade in the Deccan. The next year, an irreparable calamity overtook the Marathas. Their guiding spirit, Baji Rao Peshwa, worn out by his hard life in the field, suddenly passed away at the early age of 42 on the banks of the Narmada on 28 April 1740. He died as he had lived, said Sir Richard Campbell, in camp, on the canvas, among his men, and he is remembered to this day among the Marathas as the fighting Peshwa, or the incarnation of Hindu energy. End quote. He was the most remarkable man, next to Shivaji himself, that his nation had produced. In the words of the historian of the Marathas, his was the head to plan and the heart to execute. Tall and commanding in appearance, he was, like all his family, famous for his good looks. He was equally great as a soldier and as a statesman. He understood to perfection the particular tactics of the Maratha horse, and his campaigns against the Nizam were masterpieces of strategy. He was as chivalrous in the hour of victory as he was brave in the field. As a politician, he had the lofty and far-reaching ambitions of his father, and he lived to see the tiny Maratha people, once obscure hillbillies, starting as a cloud no bigger than a man's hand, to swell into a hurricane, and spread all over India from Delhi to Thanjavur. He was an eloquent and inspiring orator, and if in private life he had something of the haughty and imperious reserve of the Shitpavan Brahmin, he was an honest and generous master to those who served him faithfully. He made his home, during the short intervals between his campaigns, at Pune, which was fast becoming the rival of Satara, and here, in 1732, he built the famous Shanvarvada or Saturday Palace, which he decorated with all the spoils of Hindustan. Captain Inchbird, who visited Pune in 1739, describes it as well built and abounding with people, and the district as in appearance more fertile and valuable than any other he had passed through. He especially noted the Peshwa's gun foundry. Baji Rao left behind him 4 children, 2 of whom, Balaji and Raghunath Rao, familiarly known as Rakoba, rose to fame. Another son, Shamsher Bahadur, born to him by his beautiful Muslim mistress Mastani, fell at Panipat. In January 1741 he was followed to the funeral pyre by his brother Chimnachi, the conqueror of Basain, who, had he not been overshadowed by the Peshwa's transcendent genius, would have been recognized as one of the great names in Maratha history. As an administrator he was perhaps Baji Rao's superior. But he was loyally content to give his brother the credit for his achievements. His son, Shah Rao, the Bau Sahib, was destined to play a tragic part in his country's annals, as we shall see in the next episode. The death of Baji Rao was followed by the usual scramble for office. But Baji Rao, the late Peshwa's eldest son, had already insinuated himself into the old king's favour, and Shah had no hesitations bestowing upon him the robes of office, although he was only 19 at the time. The investiture took place in August 1740. Balaji's chief rival was Rakhoji Bhonsle of Berar, a kinsman of Shahu and an inveterate enemy of the Peshwas, who was away at the time on an expedition to the Karnataka. This expedition had been sent at the request of the Hindu Rajas of the south, and in particular of the Maratha prince Pratap Singh of Thanjavur, the descendant of Yankachi, the half-brother of the great Shivaji. They were threatened with extermination at the hands of Dost Ali, the Nawab of the Karnataka. The Maratha armies marched from victory to victory. Dost Ali was defeated and killed on 31 May 1740 at the Dalmacheri Pass, and in the following August, Rakhoji patched up a truce with his son Safdar Ali and proceeded to Satara to dispute the Peshwaship. Not succeeding in that, he returned to the Karnataka and in December laid siege to Chanda Sahib, Dost Ali's son-in-law in Tiruchinopalli, which fell in March 1741. Chanda Sahib was sent to Satara as a state prisoner, and he remained there for 8 years. Tiruchinopalli was handed over to the charge of Murachi Rao Korpade of Koti. Rakhoji next pretended to threaten Pondicherry, the headquarters of Chanda Sahib's French allies, but the Marathas were no match for European troops behind ramparts, and they prudently retired. This expedition, which was warmly supported by the party at court that advocated expansion in the south rather than conquest in Hindustan, was completely successful. Rakhoji Bhonsle continued after his return from the Karnataka to oppose the Peshwa, who was at length, in 1744, forced to buy off his formidable rival by allowing him the free hand in Bengal, where, as we shall see in the penultimate episode, Ali Wardi Khan, Muhammad Mirza Ali, had set himself up as independent ruler. Ali Wardi had treacherously massacred in cold blood Bhaskar Pant, Rakhoji's revenue minister, and a score of Maratha officers whom he had invited to a conference, but he had to pay heavily for this perfidy. In 1751 he was forced to surrender the province of Orissa, Cuttack, to the Marathas, with 1,200,000 rupees annually as Choud of Bengal. The Marathas never intended to establish any civil administration in the province, but left it to the local chiefs. Meanwhile, Shahu was approaching death. Shahu, the Good, was an amiable and religious man, whose piety is still fondly remembered by the Marathas. He could be magnanimous to a fallen foe, and was by no means destitute of ability. But his upbringing in a Mughal Zanana, a women's quarter, had made him ill-fitted to deal with the turbulent spirit of his age and surroundings, like his grandfather was, who had been reared in the wilds of the mountain forest. He was content to pass his time hunting, fishing and hawking, and left the drudgery of state affairs more and more to his peshwa, little realizing that he was building up a power destined to supersede his house. But it is a mistake to suppose that he was a mere puppet like his successors. He exacted the homage due to his person on every occasion. He directed all the operations, ordered and recalled commanders, and he exercised a great controlling power over the chiefs, and though he led no armies in the field, Shah was strong enough to enforce moderation even over the towering ambitions of Balaji, and forced him to leave the eastern provinces of India free for the development of the Bonsla power. Baji Rao was only a general under Shah, and the Pratinidis, Bonsles, Nimbalkars, Dabades, Kaikwas, Kadambandes, Angres, Angrias, and Korpades all respected his power. His chief defect was his intense conservatism. Do not break the old or introduce the new, was his motto, and he confirmed incapable assignees and other useless officers in their holdings, much to the detriment of the state. To the day of his death, he was incapable of shaking off the belief that he was still the vassal of the Mughal Empire, for which, and for the memory of the great emperor in whose household he was reared, he cherished the profoundest reverence. For this reason, he never approved of the policy of the Peshwas in northern India, though he was unable to check their soaring ambitions. His last years were clouded by failing health and the quarrels of his two wives, Sakwabai and Sakunabai. The latter died in 1748, and Sakwabai, the survivor, was a turbulent and ambitious woman. Lastly, he was deeply distressed at the lack of a legitimate heir. The Peshwa wished him to nominate Shambhaji, and so unite the crowns of Satara and Kolhapur, but Shahu could never overcome his dislike of his cousin, who was moreover an elderly man without heirs too, and disinherited him. He contemplated adopting a boy of the Bonsla family, when Tarabai dramatically announced the existence of a posthumous son of Shivaji II named Ramraja, who, she asserted, had been smuggled out of the fortress of Panhala at his birth and brought up in concealment by Kondali or wandering bard at Tulapur. Whether Tarabai's story was true or not will never be established, but Shahu, after due enquiry, accepted it. Sakwabai, on the other hand, stigmatized it as a fresh plot on the part of the old dowager to regain her influence. Feeling his end to be near, Shahu sent for the Peshwa, and in the presence of Govindrao Chitnis handed him this will. Quote, "We order that you should command the forces. The government of the empire must be carried on. Appoint therefore a successor, but none from Kolhapur. We have given full instructions to the Chitnis. Act accordingly. You are to take measures to preserve the kingdom. Our successors will not interfere with your posts." End quote.